In March 2009, the streets of Corpus Christi, Texas, became the scene of a nightmare that would leave a city shattered. Behind the wheel was 21-year-old Daniel Lee Lopez, reckless, desperate, and already no stranger to crime. What began as a high-speed police chase would end in the tragic death of a beloved officer, Lieutenant Stuart Alexander, a man remembered as a husband, a father, and a pillar of his community. But this was no ordinary case. Lopez, a convicted sex offender with a history of violence, didn't just face justice, he demanded it. At trial, he shocked the courtroom by asking the judge to sentence him to death. 4 years he pushed to fast-track his own execution, rejecting the appeals that might have saved his life. And when the day finally came, his last words were as defiant as his crimes. To understand how a troubled young man's path collided with a hero's final duty, and what happened in the execution chamber, we have to go back to where it all began. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss the true crime stories that stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Daniel Lee Lopez entered the world on September 15, 1987 in Texas. From the start, life for Lopez was far from stable, and the foundations of his childhood set the stage for the turbulent years to come. Growing up in Corpus Christi, he struggled to find a sense of direction. School offered little refuge. He was restless, easily drawn into conflict, and eventually left formal education behind, dropping out in the 10th grade. By then, he had already begun to build a reputation as someone headed down a dark path, drifting away from opportunity and closer to the streets. As a teenager, Lopez's life spun further out of control. He entered into volatile relationships at a young age, often marked by jealousy, violence, and instability. By his late teens, he had already fathered multiple children with different partners, piling the responsibilities of adulthood onto an already troubled youth. Instead of slowing him down, these ties seemed to fuel his recklessness. His home life, fractured and chaotic, mirrored the choices he was making in the world outside. The law soon became a familiar presence in Daniel Lopez's story. His first serious conviction was for indecency with a child, a crime that forced him to register as a sex offender, a lifelong label that branded him in the eyes of both the law and society. This wasn't a wake-up call, however. If anything, it accelerated the downward spiral. He found himself arrested for assault on multiple occasions, and his pattern of violent behavior was becoming impossible to ignore. Each arrest, each conviction, painted a clearer picture of a young man who seemed unable, or unwilling, to change course. By the time he reached his early 20s, Daniel Lopez was standing at a dangerous crossroads. He had dropped out of school, alienated many of those around him, and built up a record that left little doubt about his trajectory. The theme was clear. Lopez was a man on a self-destructive path, careening toward a collision with fate. And soon, that path would not only destroy his own life but also take the life of someone deeply cherished by his community. It was the early hours of March 11, 2009, the kind of South Texas night where the hum of distant traffic and the glow of highway lamps made the city feel almost still. But that calm was shattered when a Corpus Christi patrol car spotted a vehicle weaving dangerously through the lanes of North Padre Island Drive. Behind the wheel was 21-year-old Daniel Lee Lopez, a man already marked by a troubled past and a growing record with law enforcement. To the officers on duty, it looked like another late-night driver under the influence. What they couldn't know was that this stop would spiral into a deadly chain of events that would leave the entire city in mourning. When police signaled for Lopez to pull over, he made a choice that would define the rest of his life. Instead of slowing down, he pressed his foot harder on the accelerator. The SUV lurched forward, tires screeching, engine roaring. Within seconds, a routine stop had turned into a high-speed chase across Corpus Christi. The radio lit up with urgent voices as more patrol units joined the pursuit. Lopez's vehicle barreled down the highway, weaving recklessly at speeds so dangerous that every second felt like a potential disaster. This wasn't just about a traffic violation anymore. This was about a man willing to risk anyone and anything to avoid being caught. Officers scrambled to get ahead of the chase, coordinating in real time, knowing that if they didn't bring it to an end quickly, innocent lives could be in danger. One of those officers was Lieutenant Stuart Alexander. He was a veteran of the Corpus Christi Police Department, respected by his peers not only for his leadership but for his willingness to be the one who stepped forward when things turned dangerous. That night, as Lopez's SUV tore through the city, Alexander made the call to set up spike strips, a risky maneuver that required precise timing and immense courage. The strips, if deployed correctly, would shred Lopez's tires and bring the deadly chase to a halt. But deploying them meant placing himself directly in the path of a speeding, unpredictable vehicle. Alexander wasn't just an officer in uniform. He was a father, a husband, and a man deeply rooted in his community. But in those moments on the highway, none of that mattered to him. What mattered was stopping a suspect before someone else, perhaps another officer, perhaps a random family driving home, paid the price. He moved quickly, dragging the spike strips into position on North Padre Island Drive, illuminated by the red and blue flashes of patrol lights cutting across the darkness. The chase roared closer. Officers' voices grew tense over the radio, warning of the approaching SUV. And then, in an instant, the decision that would end one man's life and seal another's fate was made. Lopez didn't swerve. He didn't brake. He didn't yield. Instead, his SUV plowed forward, and with horrifying force, it struck Lieutenant Stuart Alexander head-on. The impact was brutal. Alexander was thrown down violently, his body broken under the weight of Lopez's speeding vehicle. For the officers watching, time seemed to freeze. The chase came to an end in chaos, not because of the spike strips, but because one of their own had just been cut down in the line of duty. Patrol cars screeched to a halt, officers sprinted to Alexander's side, and paramedics rushed to the scene. They worked frantically under the harsh glare of headlights, performing chest compressions, calling out for vitals, doing everything they could to pull him back from the brink. But it was no use. In the middle of that highway, under the flashing strobes of police cruisers, Lieutenant Stuart Alexander died. For the officers who had served alongside him, the sight was unbearable. A respected leader, a friend, a man who had stood with them through countless calls, was gone in an instant. Some officers wept openly, others stood frozen in shock, their faces lit by the swirling lights. Word traveled fast through the department. A lieutenant had been killed in the line of duty. And then came the most devastating blow, news reaching his family. For his wife and children, the night had begun like any other. A routine shift, a promise that he'd be home. But now, instead of seeing him walk through the door, they were told he would never return. The community too was shaken. Lieutenant Alexander wasn't just another name in the headlines. He was a man people knew, a coach at youth events, a familiar face in the neighborhood, the officer who always seemed calm even in the worst situations. The aftermath of the tragedy on North Padre Island Drive sent shockwaves across Corpus Christi, and for Daniel Lee Lopez, there was no escape from accountability. Within hours of fatally striking Lieutenant Stuart Alexander, Lopez was tracked down, arrested, and charged with capital murder, a charge that carries the harshest of consequences in the state of Texas. From the very beginning, the weight of his actions loomed over every step of the legal process. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Eyewitness officers who had been part of the chase, dashcam footage that captured his reckless flight, and the devastating loss of a veteran police lieutenant who had given his life in the line of duty. By 2010, the trial was underway, and the courtroom became a theater of grief, anger, and disbelief. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out its case, hammering home the point that Lopez had not only fled the police that night but had knowingly and deliberately risked the lives of everyone on the road. They argued that when Lopez barreled through that stretch of highway, ignoring flashing lights and orders to stop, he made a choice that cost Lieutenant Alexander his life. To the prosecution it was clear, this wasn't just reckless driving, it was murder in the course of fleeing law enforcement, and under Texas law that meant capital murder. The defense, however, struggled to find any ground on which to stand. They attempted to paint Lopez as a troubled man with a volatile past, someone whose life had spiraled out of control long before that fateful night. But any sympathy they tried to muster was quickly crushed by Lopez's own shocking stance in the courtroom. Instead of fighting for his life, Lopez stunned everyone by openly requesting the death penalty. He told the court, in no uncertain terms, that he did not want to live the rest of his life behind bars. To him, life in prison was a punishment far worse than execution. His words rang cold, almost defiant, leaving the families of both sides shaken. The jury, after hearing days of testimony and evidence, delivered the only verdict they believed justice demanded: guilty of capital murder. And when it came time for sentencing, the judge echoed the jury's decision, condemning Daniel Lee Lopez to death. What stood out, however, was not just the sentence but Lopez's demeanor throughout. There was no tearful apology, no attempt to beg for forgiveness, no visible remorse. Instead, he leaned into his fate as if he had chosen it for himself, turning his trial into a stage where he invited death rather than fought for redemption. For the family of Lieutenant Alexander, the trial brought a measure of closure but not comfort. They watched as the man responsible for tearing a husband, father, and respected officer from their lives showed no regret for the devastation he had caused. For the city of Corpus Christi, the trial was a painful reminder of how quickly chaos can strike, how a single man's choices can ripple outward to destroy so many lives. And for Lopez, the trial sealed the path he seemed determined to walk from the moment of his arrest. A straight line to Texas death row with no stops for appeals or second chances. In Texas, a death sentence does not end with the slam of a judge's gavel. By law, every capital murder conviction triggers an automatic appeals process, designed to safeguard against wrongful convictions, misconduct, or errors in trial proceedings. But in the case of Daniel Lee Lopez, the appeals process became something far more unusual, a legal battle not about fighting death but about demanding it. After the trial ended and the judge pronounced the ultimate sentence, Daniel Lee Lopez was transferred to the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, the state's notorious death row facility. It was here, in a tiny concrete cell measuring barely 6 by 9 feet, that Lopez would spend the final years of his life. The isolation was absolute. Inmates on Texas death row are locked away for 23 hours a day, with little more than a steel bunk, a narrow desk, and a slot in the door through which meals are passed. Contact with the outside world is stripped down to letters, monitored phone calls, and tightly regulated visits. For many condemned men, this slow erosion of freedom is torture. For Lopez, it became the life he dreaded most, the very existence he had sworn he wanted to escape. Reports from within Polunsky described Lopez as restless, at times even impatient. He was not like other inmates who spent years plotting appeals, clinging to hope that some technicality might spare them. Instead, Lopez spoke openly about his desire for the end to come. He wrote letters to friends and family that carried a tone of finality, sometimes reflecting on the life he had wasted, but often blunt about his wish to avoid decades in a cage. Prison staff noted his unusual resolve. Where most men feared the needle, Lopez seemed to anticipate it, as though each day of delay was its own kind of punishment. In the weeks leading up to his scheduled execution, Lopez received a handful of visits from those who still stood by him. Family members came to Livingston, meeting him behind thick glass in the visitation booths. Conversations were strained, marked by long silences and awkward laughter, the kind of exchanges where words fail in the shadow of death. Some relatives urged him to reconsider, to fight harder, to at least allow the appeals to continue. But Lopez remained unmoved. He told them he had made his peace, that he would rather face death than grow old behind concrete walls. To them, it sounded less like acceptance and more like resignation. A man so consumed by his own defiance that he refused to grant even the system the satisfaction of breaking him slowly. As the final days dwindled, Lopez's mindset seemed almost eerily calm. Other men facing execution often waver, swinging between panic, hope, and despair, but Lopez appeared steady, his impatience more visible than fear. In his final week, he told a prison chaplain that he was ready, that nothing the courts or lawyers did would change what he wanted. His last meals in the unit were routine prison fare, stripped of ritual until the final night. He declined any special requests, telling staff he did not need a feast, because nothing about his life felt worth celebrating. Inside the Polunsky unit, where every man counts his days in shadows, Daniel Lee Lopez stood out as someone who seemed to invite the darkness instead of hiding from it. While the clock ticked toward his scheduled execution, he carried himself not as a man dreading the end, but as one impatient for it to finally arrive. By the afternoon of August 12, 2015, the city of Huntsville, Texas, once again stood at the center of the nation's attention. Inside the red-bricked walls of the Huntsville unit, home to the state's execution chamber, the final chapter of Daniel Lee Lopez's turbulent life was about to unfold. For years he had insisted that death was preferable to a lifetime behind bars, and now, under the heavy air of a late summer evening, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice was preparing to grant him exactly what he had demanded. The execution chamber itself was stark, clinical, and deliberately devoid of comfort. A narrow, gurney-like bed with thick leather straps occupied the center of the room, its purpose chillingly clear. Fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow, illuminating the pale green walls, while behind a large glass window, rows of chairs waited for witnesses, family members of the victim, media representatives, and a small number of officials. It was a place designed not for mercy but for finality, a chamber where the state carried out its most irreversible sentence. Lopez's day had begun in the same way it would end, quietly, almost without ceremony. Unlike other inmates who request elaborate final meals, often symbolic or indulgent, Lopez had declined the offer. Texas had long since abolished the practice of honoring extravagant requests after abuses of the tradition, but even the simple choice of a special tray was something Lopez refused. He accepted only the standard prison meal served to every inmate that evening, further underscoring his attitude that nothing about this day warranted celebration or ritual. When the hour arrived, Lopez was led into the chamber, strapped securely to the gurney and prepared for the procedure. As the curtains were drawn back, those gathered on the witness side of the glass could see him lying still, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. Among the observers were members of Lieutenant Stuart Alexander's family, whose lives had been permanently scarred by the events of March 11, 2009. For them, this moment carried the weight of both justice and unbearable loss. Then came Lopez's final chance to speak. At first, his words carried defiance. Looking through the glass he began, "I would like to tell my family I love y'all, and I appreciate y'all being here. The system is not fair and I want to tell the media, it's not fair. You can kiss my..." His statement trailed into an obscenity shocking some in the chamber. But then, in a quieter, more hurried tone, Lopez shifted. His voice softened as he added, "I hope this execution helps my family and also the victim's family. This was never meant to be, sure, beyond my power. I can only walk the path before me and make the best of it. I'm sorry for putting you all through this. I'm sorry. I love you. I am ready. May we all go to heaven." The contrast in his words left witnesses with mixed emotions. For Alexander's family, the initial defiance stung like a final insult, but the softer apology that followed offered a glimpse, however fleeting, of remorse. Reporters later described the room as tense, divided between anger at his provocations and surprise at his sudden turn toward contrition. It was a rare duality in a death chamber, the condemned man cursing the system even as he asked forgiveness. At precisely 6:31 p.m., the attending physician stepped forward, checked for signs of life, and pronounced Daniel Lee Lopez dead. Outside the prison walls, the Texas flag flew at half-staff, and inside, silence lingered as the witnesses were escorted away. One chapter of the tragedy had closed, but the grief endured, carried by those who had lost a husband, a father, and a respected police lieutenant. And that brings us to the end of the tragic story of Daniel Lee Lopez and the life of Lieutenant Stuart Alexander. Now we'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe justice was served or do you see it differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below, because your input keeps these discussions alive. If you found this video informative, make sure to hit that like button, share it with others who follow true crime stories, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next case we cover.